So today is known as Easter Sunday, or we call it Resurrection Sunday in the Christian calendar, and it is to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming, because we really appreciate you coming out. I know you have lots of options. You know, in our world of options, there's so many things you could be doing today, but you chose to come out, and so I really appreciate that. Or if somebody brought you to church, thank you for bringing them to church, and thank you for showing up with them. That's a really cool thing. Today, we're going to talk about the resurrection, as I have for 15 Easters here at Coffee Creek, and we are going to talk about it once again, but there's nothing new with the story. The story hasn't changed in 15 years. Today, I am going to take a little bit different angle at the story, and one that I find interesting. I mean, I can only talk from what I find interesting, so if you connect with it, good. I hope that you find it interesting, but this is an angle, as I've researched and studied the resurrection, that I find interesting, and I think you will too. Today, we're going to talk about this concept of, next Sunday, we'll talk about how does it impact you? Like, what is the afterlife like? We'll talk about heaven for 3 weeks. We have a new series starting. But today, specifically in dealing with Jesus' resurrection, I wanted to talk about what would it look like if it had never happened? What would our world look like? And I think it's interesting to think about things like that sometimes. I don't know if you've seen the Marvel series called What If, but it asks interesting questions like, what if, a villain was a hero, or a hero was a villain, or if a character's trajectory in life was different? And it creates interesting kind of narratives about that. There was also a series on Amazon, which was a book before that, called The Man in the High Castle. Some of you probably saw that or you read that book. And its premise was, what if the Allies had not won World War II? And what if America was under occupation? About a third of our country, like California side, is Japan territory, and the rest of the country is a German territory. What would an America have looked like under that kind of occupation? Terribly interesting questions, right? I mean, it's horrifying to think about some of that. Or maybe you remember reading this book. Some of you read this book, or you read a short story of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty when you were in school. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is this concept of this guy, and this is a very old movie too, but it's this concept of this guy where he's kind of daydreaming all the time about what his life might have been if he'd have done something different in life. So what if he was a secret agent? Or what if he was a surgeon? Or what if he had been a really wealthy guy? All these different timelines. You ever do that with your own life? You ever kind of think, what might have been if I'd have gone this direction, or if I'd had this relationship didn't end, or if I'd have chosen this job, this career? I think about that sometimes. When I was growing up, all I wanted to be was a police officer. I mean, drove my parents nuts, because all I talked about was police officer, police officer, police officer. And they're like, you don't even know a police officer. Why do you want to be a police officer? Well, I was just wrapped up in it. I don't know. I just had that thing as a kid. That gradually went away. When I went to college, I decided I was going to be a museum curator. I don't appreciate that laughing. I just wanted to hush over the crowd, but some of you snickered. Yeah, and you're like, he's not serious. I'm like, I changed my major to anthropology. I was in the anthropology club. I was that serious about becoming a museum curator. And most of you are like, this is horrific, and I'm going to leave right now. Why did he want to become a museum? I don't know. I like museums. I thought it would be cool. But I got out of that eventually, and I came to this job where I have been for 24 years. And I love my job. I definitely feel like I found my calling in life. But prior to that, I was all over the place. And then sometimes, even though I love what I do think about what would have been like. What would my life have looked like down that path? And I'm sure you've done the same thing. It's not that we're second guessing. It is kind of that we're interested in what would it have been like if I'd have made different choices. Well, today I want to ask this question, because I think it's an interesting question. I think some of you driving here this morning had this question in your mind. And I think at a certain point, all of us have had this nagging kind of question. What if the resurrection didn't happen? I want to look at it from the angle of what would the natural effects have been. And then I want to talk about what it would like if the resurrection happened. So we'll talk about both sides today. If the resurrection didn't happen, and I want you to know right off the bat that this sermon is plagiarized. I have not made this concept up. It is not unique to me. I'm not creative enough to come up with something like that. Paul actually started asking these questions back in the first century in the New Testament. If you don't know who Paul is what's called an apostle. He's one of the earlier believers of Jesus. He's not with the original disciples, but he is very early on. He has a supernatural experience with Jesus, and he begins writing letters to these churches, these early young churches, right around the start of the church. And he writes about 2/3 of what we call the New Testament. So about 2/3 of those letters that we call books are written by Paul to churches. And when I say to churches, I don't mean like to an individual church. It would be like to all the churches of Oklahoma City. And those letters would have been passed around and read around by people in those churches. So that's kind of how they communicated back then. And so today we're going to look at Paul's writing to the churches in Corinthians, where he asks the same questions that I'm asking today. So basically, this section begins in verse 12 of chapter 15. And Paul says there, "Tell me this. Since we preach that Christ rose from the dead, why are some of you saying there will be no resurrection of the dead?" So already early on, there are some questions. Now notice that the question is not, did Christ resurrect? But the question is about transferability. Does Christ's power to resurrect transfer? In the early church, there really was not a discussion about did Jesus resurrect or not, because you would not have been a church if you didn't believe in that. Like, the Christian church began with one central truth: the resurrection of Jesus. This is what the church started on. It wasn't a social organization. It wasn't a political organization. It didn't have a standing army. It didn't have a lot of money. It didn't have a lot of people. It was an organization based on the testimony of the disciples that Jesus was resurrected. That is the beginning point, the origin story of the church. So there was no discussion about whether Jesus resurrected. The question was on, does that transfer to us? And Paul says, those two things are so linked together, you can't say one without the other is where he's going. He says, in verse 13, "For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And we apostles would all be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there's no resurrection of the dead. And if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless, and you are still guilty of your sins. In that case," and here's a really negative downfall, "in that case, all who have died believing in Christ are lost. And if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are more to be pitied than anyone in the world." He's saying Christ's resurrection transfers to his followers. It is not something that ended with Christ. And those things are so inextricably linked because that's why Christ died, for that to become a thing. Verse 20, "But in fact," he says, "Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of all who have died." Now, the skeptic in me has a lot of questions about resurrection. Since I was a kid, I've always liked to take things apart and see how they work. I'm a tinkerer. I remember when I took our VCR apart and it didn't go back together correctly. I'm not good at that. I'm not an engineer. I'm not good at building things. I'm great at taking things apart. I love to see how they work. I remember the first computer I built when I was 14 years old, and I turned it on and it started smoking. And I was like, that's not good. And I told a friend of mine, and he was like, "Yeah, that's what computers run on. If the smoke comes out, they stop working." And I was like, "That's the worst joke ever because I broke this thing." And back then, when you had a computer, you could get a warranty on it from, there's a company called Sears. Some of you remember Sears. I had a warranty from Sears, and I lived in the country, and they sent a dishwasher repairman to come repair my computer. And he and I sat in the bedroom on my floor, and we just stared at this thing that was all burned up. And he goes, "Man, it looks like you really messed this up." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm aware of that. Are you going to fix it?" And he's like, "I'm not a computer repairman." I'm like, "Oh, man." But I digress. I've always liked to reverse engineer things, take things apart. So with the resurrection, I was always a skeptic. And I was always like, and still am to some point, I want to know. I need to know. I need to take it apart and understand it, because I don't want to believe in the resurrection just because I want to believe in the resurrection. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want it just to be true because I want it to be true. But the reality is, if the resurrection didn't occur, there are pretty negative impacts for our world. Let's talk about that, because Paul brought those out. First of all, if the resurrection didn't happen, pain, suffering, and death win. This is almost unfathomable to most of us who have had any sort of trauma or pain or experience of losing a loved one. That evil trifecta would win is really difficult to put our minds around, because the hope is so strong that they don't win in the end. Now, that does nothing to prove the resurrection. It's just a negative outcome if the resurrection didn't occur. That evil wins. Paul said this is all pointless. Church, preaching, everything, Easter celebration, all completely pointless. The millions and millions of Christians that have gone to the grave, all pointless. Every Christian funeral, pointless. All for naught. All the preaching we do, are there some good things that Christian organizations do? Sure. But if the resurrection didn't happen, I always say it every Easter, that's the linchpin. That's the one thing. That's where the church started. That's our origin story. We started on the resurrection of Christ. The church couldn't have taken off without that. That was the point of, think about any other organization who loses its leader. They all scatter and fall apart. And this organization wasn't just based on Jesus was a good teacher. It was based on Jesus was the Son of God, and he died, but yet he's not dead. That's the testimony of the organization. That's the beginning point. That's a difficult thing to come back from if the resurrection did not occur. If people would have said, no, that's not true. And finally, there's an almost unbearable weight if the resurrection didn't occur. Without the resurrection, we don't have forgiveness. Our sins have not been washed away. Every Christian funeral, as I said, is invalidated. All of us bear this almost unbearable weight of pain and guilt and shame because there is no resolution to that. And these are the problems that Paul was bringing up. And he was saying, look, if we don't understand that the resurrection of us and the resurrection of Jesus are tied together, as these things happened, then all of this is the fallout. So the flip side then I want to talk about is, what if the resurrection did happen? But like I said, it's not logically valid to say, I don't like those things. Those are terrible, negative consequences that I don't want for myself or any of you. And so I'm just going to wish upon a falling star or hope that the resurrection occurred. That also is not congruent with a logical thinker, right? I mean, that's not just because I want something. You and I have been talking about this for 15 years. I've been wishing every birthday, and 46 is coming up, and every birthday I walk out in the driveway and that Lamborghini Diablo is not there. I close my eyes really tight, and I do all of the things, and I walk out there and there's no Lamborghini. My parents made a big joke when I turned 16 and put it on my cake, a little Matchbox one. That was real funny. Ha, ha, ha. I've been talking about Lamborghini Diablo. I had a poster when I was a kid of one. I've been talking about it for a long time. But it never just magically appears, because that's not reality. And so in the same way, I don't want to do that with this. I don't want to just hope blindly, wish on a falling star, blow my candles out and hope. I want to know. I did some research, and there is a professor, Gary Habermas, and also another one named William Lane Craig, and they've done some work on what they call the minimal facts approach that I find very compelling. So again, I'm not trying to convince you today of anything. I don't think I'm that good of a debater. All I want to do is share with you what I have learned and discovered and what I find compelling. And you may find it compelling. You may not find it compelling. You may find it an interesting conversation pieces I have. But the minimal facts approach is really cool to me, because what it tries to do is establish a minimal basis of facts on which to talk about the resurrection with anyone. Skeptic, agnostic, that's someone that's not sure whether God is real or not. Atheist, someone that's pretty dead certain that he's not real. People that believe in the resurrection, people that don't believe in the resurrection. Skeptics and Christians. all of these people together. He said, I only consider something historically verifiable, data that's verifiable, if at least something like 90% of the scholars that study this that are peer-reviewed, meaning they write an article, they publish in a journal, and they have other peers that are critical of that write and look at that and say, this makes sense historically, or you're making stuff up, right? That's how peer-reviewed academic research works. So these guys are smart. These are not like Pastor Clark. These are like guys that this is their living. They work in universities, and they do research at that level. And this is what they did. They said the minimal facts approach is going to establish what are historically certifiable. And they set standards for that. And they said, we want to invite everyone into the conversation. Skeptics. We want to invite historians, critical. We want to invite people that are critical of the text. And listen to some of the things that they've said. I love this because here's the idea. They've said the Bible, we're going to consider it a historical document, but we're not going to consider it divinely inspired for the purposes of this approach. Because they said, otherwise, if we say the Bible is divinely inspired, we lose a whole bunch of people that are very skeptical. So they said, will you accept at least that it's a historical document? Okay, it's one historical voice. They would bring it in. So they widened their field really wide. And they invited some of the most critical people of Christianity and the story of resurrection to speak into this study. And then they said, here's what we will hold the New Testament to. We will hold it to be historical records that were penned during the first century. And the authors of this study said, look, if we can find a minimal amount of data that points to the resurrection as the most plausible, most reasonable hypothesis of the resurrection, then we should infer that it is the most plausible if there's no other evidence pointing to anything else. And so they established 12. They established 12 different facts. Today, I'm only going to take you through 4 of them that I find personally the most compelling facts. Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, that the tomb was empty. Number 3, that there were post-resurrection appearances of Jesus reported. And number 4, that the origin of the Christian church and the story around that points to resurrection. Now, these are the ones, again, that I find most verifiable, I find most credible, I find most challenging. You may like the others better. I'll talk about some of the others throughout the year. But today for Easter, I think these 4 are really bedrock to this. Let's talk about the first one, that Jesus died by crucifixion. In the 4 New Testament Gospels, you have recordings of Jesus being crucified. One of the things you may not know about the crucifixion is that, in the TV shows, the movies, we have them all very high up on a high cross. That's actually not what we have learned from historians. Crosses were at eye level. And so you would walk by and you could look someone that was hanging on a cross in the eye. And we've learned from historical accounts about the crucifixion that the Romans invented this as a way to be particularly brutal to enemies of the state, as a way to be particularly brutal to people that they didn't like. And so it was not a normal way to execute prisoners. It was a very public, humiliating, painful, agonizing death. We know that it wasn't invented for Jesus. It was just another way to crucify and to get rid of someone that they didn't like. In fact, Jesus was crucified with other people. And so as we study this and learn about this, we see that it is not just the Bible that talks about the crucifixion of Jesus. We have several non-Christian sources. Jewish historian Josephus wrote about this. There was a Roman historian that wrote about this, and the Greek satirist Lucian wrote about this. In fact, the Jewish Talmud even has text about the crucifixion of Jesus. The authors and those working in the study came together and said, this meets the historical criteria to establish the account of the crucifixion of Jesus happened, it occurred. There are enough multiple, independent, credible eyewitness sources that made these accounts that we can say Jesus died by crucifixion. It's a pretty basic point, but it builds. The second thing, that the tomb was empty. This is more interesting, I think, because you move to a second point here. where I read in a recent thing that was kind of news to me, or at least a new way of thinking about it. When they took them down off the cross, they would commonly just throw the bodies into a big pit of other bodies, all of the criminals that were crucified in this way. They just threw them in a big pit. There was not a ceremony. There was not a funeral. They didn't care about these people. They were unhuman, basically, to them at that point. So they just threw them in a pit. Joseph of Arimathea, this man who had compassion, wanted Jesus to be put in a tomb. And so he made provision for that to happen. Had that not happened, there wouldn't be a tomb to be empty or full. Jesus' body would have been just thrown in with all the other bodies, and we would have never known. Had his body been stolen, somebody taken it, who knew? But he was put in a tomb under Roman guard to eliminate that possibility in some ways from the Roman government. And yet, you have the women's accounts at the tomb that it was empty. You have written records that it was empty. And the early church, I will remind you, started on the testimony that Jesus' body was not in the tomb. It started on the idea of resurrection. Now, look at every organization, religious group that has started after Jesus. If someone made a claim like that they were supernaturally resurrected, it stands to reason that someone else would say that didn't happen. Right? I mean, I can point to multiple examples. I can point to the David Koreshes of this world. I can point to the Jim Jones of this world. I can point in the early Americas to a fellow that said an angel gave him some golden tablets, and tons of people said, yeah, that didn't happen. I mean, there's always a counter-narrative that is historical in that time of the peers saying, no. What we don't have, according to historians, is a credible narrative that counters the empty tomb. There's no one saying the tomb wasn't empty. Had that been a thing, most scholars believe they should have been something there. So there's a skeptic and historian, Michael Grant, who does not believe in the resurrection, but he wrote this. He said, the historian cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb, since applied historical criteria that we apply to every event in history that we weren't personally there for, the evidence shows, he said, it is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. He doesn't say how the tomb was found empty. He doesn't ascribe supernatural things to that. But here's a skeptic saying, we cannot deny that the tomb was empty. It was found empty. It meets historical criteria to have been found empty. So I'm going to green light that one for me. Number 3, that there were post-resurrections appearances of Jesus are recorded. This again fits the definition of historically reliable criteria for that people said this happened. Not saying that it happened, but saying that people said it happened. Every historian almost agrees with this. You have the 11 disciples who saw Jesus. You have the women at the tomb. You have 12 disciples later when Thomas is there with them. You have James. You have the Apostle Paul. You have multiple, and that's even leaving out others. There's one where there was over 500 people. But leaving out those, just with the base ones we have, you have written records from people that said, yeah, I saw Jesus. Now, are there other explanations for that? Everybody's got hypotheses. Everybody's got all these big ideas. But that people said they saw Jesus after death bodily walking around, that is a record. That occurred. So there are post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in historical record. And the last one I find very interesting to me is that there are at least 12 verifiable facts, I said, but these 4, and the 4th one is the most compelling to me, is that the church should have been stamped out. The church should have just been ended right then. But the church started on the story of resurrection. That's where they began. It's been in the earliest of creeds of the church since the 2nd century. The first century church, that's what their story was, is that Jesus was resurrected, and they had the belief that they too would be resurrected. Paul's teaching it in today's text. So what if the resurrection happened? Well, it means evil lost. It means suffering and death ends. It means our message is powerful, not weak. And it means that the Christian funerals are not invalidated, but instead, there's no weight, there's no shame, there's no guilt. Your sins can be forgiven. Paul writes like this to the Colossian church. He says, "For you were buried with Christ when you were baptized, and with him you were raised to new life, because you trusted the mighty power of God, who raised Christ from the dead." This new life is available to every single one of us. No one is excluded. You are included. You have been given an opportunity not to just believe in something because you want to believe in it, but because it makes the most logical sense. I say reasonable. They use the word plausible, but I think reasonable, the reasonableness of the resurrection, that makes the most sense to me. What if the resurrection did happen? What are the implications for you? Well, you've got a choice to make with what I've taught you today. You've got a choice to make with what we've talked about, what Paul said, what the early church experienced, what these scholars have looked at. You have a choice with what to do with that. But here's what I don't want you to do. Here's what I would not want you to do, is to not believe in the resurrection because you're just scared of what it might mean for you personally. And I am afraid that sometimes we do that because we're afraid of the implications of what that might mean for us. How much of my life have I wasted to this point? How many paths have I gone down? That's an artificial, illogical way to think about this. If the most plausible, logical definition, if you arrive at that point, don't let anything hold you back from addressing the facts and making a choice, even if it's a new choice today. Our life is full of choices. When I was a kid, one of my favorite books was the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Has everybody ever read Choose Your Own Adventures? Woo, a few more in this one. Let's go nerds. Yeah. Man, when I would go to the Scholastic Book Fair, I would try to bankrupt my parents buying Choose Your Own Adventure books. I love Choose Your Own Adventure. If you're not aware what the book was, basically you're reading it, and it's like a first-person book. So you're the cowboy, you're the space guy, you're the time traveler, you're the point of the story, you're the character, the main character. And you get to a point in the book, you read maybe a couple chapters in, and you're presented with a choice. You know, do you want to go this way down the street? Go to page 21. You want to go this way down the street? Go to page 18. You flip to that page, and you deal with the consequences of that decision. Do you want to rob the bank, or do you want to save the lady from the bad guys? You deal with the consequences. And sometimes it's a dead end. It's like, well, that was a dumb choice. End. The end. Man, I hit those all the time. It's so frustrating. Then you go back and start over. And so you kind of got a new advantage. It was kind of this before the internet thing where you got to make choices. It's kind of like video games are today for kids, I guess. This was paper. Paper Kids is this thing made out of trees and bound together and, sorry. But it was kind of cool. And today you have that same thing. It's an adventure. You have a choice to make.